Are you a toxic church member? I wrote a book called Breaking Toxic Soul Ties, and I thought it would be a good teaching to talk to church members about whether or not they are toxic in their own church. Let's face it, as a church member, you do want to be a blessing to your church, right? You want to see your church grow. You want to see the pastor blessed, right? Well, good members always want to see that, but toxic members have a way to working against that. So what are the characteristics of a toxic church member? And maybe you're one of them. And if you are, I hope that this teaching will cause you to repent. First, a toxic church member does not show respect to their pastor. Paul wrote in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17, obey your leaders and submit to their authority. They keep watch over you as men who must give an account. Obey them so their work will be a joy, not a burden, for that will be of no advantage to you. See, when you don't submit to your pastor, you know what happens? You become the pastor's burden. And he has such a hard time with you because you're constantly opposing his decisions. And you can't do that. See, you have to respect your pastor for one reason. He is your pastor. Not because he's perfect, not because he doesn't sin, but because he has been called of God to be the senior pastor of your church. But toxic church members, they don't get it. They don't understand there's authority in the church. And they just feel like they can just talk to the pastor, rebuke him, correct him, tell him what, think of him. No, you cannot do that. You have to show respect and honor. Paul wrote to the Romans, show honor to whom honor is due. And don't convince yourself, my pastor don't deserve honor because he's made so many mistakes in life. Stop it. We all make mistakes. A pastor's not perfect. The only pastor that's perfect is Jesus. And he had a toxic church member too named Judas Iscariot. So if Jesus had a toxic church member, I'm convinced that your pastor's going to have some. I'm just hoping you're not one of them. So toxic church members, they are disrespectful to the pastor. They forget that they have to submit to the pastor. And so, listen, toxic church members don't have to, look, you don't have to agree with your pastor in every decision. But you do have to accept his decisions. You understand? You still have to submit to his decisions, whether you agree with it or not. Toxic church members, though, they don't like to submit, and they like to talk bad about the decisions of the pastor. Is that you? Are you a toxic church member? Submit to your pastor. A toxic church member doesn't understand loyalty. You see, Jonathan was a good person to David. And even though Jonathan should have been the king, he knew from God's perspective that David was supposed to be the new king. So what does he do in 1 Samuel 13? He makes a covenant with David and takes his weapons and hands it, basically saying, I'm going to fight for you, not against you. And so Jonathan was loyal to David. See, good members, they show loyalty to the church and to their pastor. So when Sunday morning comes around, the good church member is in church Sunday morning. They're not somewhere else because some famous preacher is coming to town. No. A good member goes to his church and supports his pastor, even if a famous minister is in another church on Sunday morning. But toxic members often don't understand this loyalty. And they just kind of treat their pastor as, well, if I want to be a part of your church, I'll part of it. If I don't, I'll go somewhere else. They don't get it. They don't understand loyalty. Third thing about toxic church members is they talk too much and too bad about the pastor. It says in Proverbs 16:28, a perverse man stirs up dissension, and a gossip separates close friends. You know, you could be a close friend of your pastor, but then with your gossiping, talking bad about him behind his back, sooner or later, those words are going to get to the pastor that you've been talking bad about him. And why are you doing this? Is this what God's used your tongue for? He wants you to talk bad about your pastor and tell everyone where you think the pastor's wrong and what he's doing wrong? Come on. That's not your call. Your call is to pray for your pastor, not gossip. And I'm telling you, gossiping can stir up dissension and separate you from the close relationship you've had with the pastor. And then finally, a toxic church member brings division in the church. You see, above all things, the pastor has to guard the unity of the church. When Jesus prayed in the garden, he prayed for the unity of the church. Bible says strive and make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. But toxic church members, they care little about the unity of the church because they forget a house divided against itself will not stand. So a toxic church member will start to bring division and disunity, usually through their words, sometimes through their actions, and that cannot be tolerated. It cannot be tolerated. So what does the pastor do with a toxic church member? You know what he has to do? Unfortunately, he has to remove that person eventually. Proverbs 22:10 says, drive out the mocker and out goes strife. Quarrels and insults are ended. And a pastor has a duty to the whole church of God. And he has to protect the church. So when he sees that there's someone now bringing harm to the church, he can't not let you stay in the church. He has to remove you. Now, this is not necessarily excommunication. Excommunication is when a person is a heretic and they have to be removed. But sometimes a person can still hold to orthodox teachings, but yet their heart is not right. Their heart is divided. Their heart is full of strife and dissension. And friend, that person has to be removed. Friend, you're going to have to be removed from your church unless you're willing to repent and say, God, I'm sorry for what I've done. And become the kind of good member you always intended to be, and stop being a toxic church member.